"What are you doing in my shed?" "Ma'am, I'm fixing the roof leak on my property." "Your property? This is HOA property. I'll have you fined, evicted, and arrested." So yeah, that's Karen, the self-appointed president of our HOA, screaming at me while holding a clipboard like it's a weapon. She'd just broken into my shed, snapped photos of my tools, and accused me of running an illegal home repair operation. Hit that like button if you've ever met someone allergic to minding their own business. Subscribe for more stories where suburban tyrants get humbled by reality, because this time, Karen was about to find out what happens when she messes with a guy who builds demolitions for a living. When I bought this house, all I wanted was a quiet place to work on my projects and drink coffee without being judged by the HOA patrol. The shed out back was my sanctuary. It smelled like cedar and motor oil, the kind of scent that makes you feel productive even when you're just rearranging tools. That morning the sun was still low, cutting across the yard in gold stripes as I set up my toolbox and laid out my new roof sealant. I had my earbuds in, music low, a cup of coffee on the windowsill, and for once, everything in my life felt still. Then I heard the metallic click of my shed door being forced open from the other side. At first I thought it was the wind, then came the voice, sharp and nasal, the unmistakable sound of authority that had never been earned. "Excuse me, what is this?" she said, like she'd just caught a burglar. I turned, confused, and there she was, Karen, the self-appointed neighborhood monarch, standing halfway inside my shed, phone in one hand, clipboard in the other. She was filming. She actually had the nerve to look around like a detective examining a crime scene. Her eyes flicked from the shelves to the workbench, cataloging every item as if the presence of a hammer violated national security. I pulled out my earbuds and tried to keep my voice level. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, though what I meant was, "Why are you in my shed?" She gave me that smile people use when they're pretending to be polite but are really enjoying the power trip. "I received a report," she said, tapping her clipboard like she was about to hand down a sentence. "Someone's been conducting unapproved construction activities. This shed appears to have been modified." That word modified rolled off her tongue like a felony. I told her it was my property, my tools, and my weekend project, but she shook her head like a disappointed teacher. "The HOA requires prior approval for all exterior structures," she said, her voice rising an octave. "Even storage units. I could fine you up to $5,000 for this kind of violation." She wasn't asking me to stop. She was daring me to argue. My patience was evaporating, but I tried reason first. "Ma'am, this shed's been here longer than both of us. I'm just replacing the roof panels." She ignored me, crouched beside my toolbox, and snapped a picture of my drill. "Evidence," she muttered. Then she looked up, eyes gleaming. "Are you running a business from here? I see professional-grade equipment." I laughed, because it was that or yell. "I'm a contractor. These are my tools. What exactly do you think I'm doing, manufacturing submarines?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked further inside, picked up a wrench, and turned it over like she'd found contraband. The sheer absurdity of it all made me feel like I'd stepped into a sitcom where logic didn't exist. When I told her to leave, she crossed her arms and announced she was documenting a violation for community safety. I could see her phone's live stream app running, comments flying across the screen. She was broadcasting this to whoever followed her HOA drama online. The idea that my quiet morning project had turned into content for her digital crusade was so insane that for a few seconds I just stood there, speechless. Then I took a step forward, pointed to the open door, and said, as calmly as I could, "You're trespassing. Leave now." She gasped like I'd struck her. "This property is under HOA jurisdiction," she snapped. "Technically, everything within these boundaries belongs to the community trust." I stared at her, trying to decide if she was joking. She wasn't. The woman genuinely believed she had ownership rights over my backyard. That's when she pulled out her phone again and dialed the police. "Yes, I'd like to report an aggressive homeowner interfering with an HOA inspection," she said, glaring at me like she was narrating a documentary about criminal masterminds. "He's yelling and threatening me. Please hurry." I hadn't even raised my voice. By the time the sirens echoed faintly in the distance, I was sitting on the porch steps with my coffee gone cold, watching her pace the lawn like a general waiting for reinforcements. My quiet Saturday had become a public spectacle. Neighbors peeked from windows, kids whispered from the sidewalk, and there stood Karen, guarding my shed like it contained state secrets. When the officers arrived, I thought common sense would finally prevail. But as they stepped out of the car, I realized something chilling. Karen greeted them by name. One of the officers laughed politely, called her Mrs. Reynolds, and listened as she launched into a dramatic retelling about illegal modifications and suspicious business activity. They looked at me, then at her phone, which was still filming, and asked me to step aside while they sorted things out. I remember sitting there thinking how unreal it all felt. This was my home, my shed, my property. Yet somehow, I was the one being treated like a suspect. And as Karen smiled behind her sunglasses, arms crossed in victory, I knew this wasn't going to be the last time she tried to make my life a living nightmare. It was only the beginning. The following week began with the kind of dread that settles in your chest like cement. I knew the HOA would summon me for what they called a compliance hearing, which, in normal English, meant a group of nosy neighbors sitting in a rented room pretending to be a court of law. I showed up early, dressed neatly, coffee in hand, determined to be calm. The clubhouse smelled like old carpet and self-righteousness. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everyone in a sickly yellow hue that perfectly matched the tone of the meeting waiting to happen. Karen sat at the head of the folding table, her posture perfect, her smile razor-sharp. Beside her sat two other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. On the wall behind her hung a laminated banner that read, "Maintaining excellence in our community." The word excellence had a coffee stain running through it, which felt poetic. She called the meeting to order with a gavel that I swear she must have bought just for moments like this. "Mr. Adams," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you've been reported for operating a commercial repair business from your residence, violating Section 4, Subsection 7 of the Community Regulations." She slid a stack of papers across the table like she was presenting evidence in a high-stakes trial. On top were printed screenshots from her live stream, showing my tools, my truck, and my face mid-blink, all captioned, "Illegal operation in progress." I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "That's my shed," I said. "Those are my tools. I'm not running a business out of it. I was fixing a leak." My tone was even, but I could feel my pulse pounding behind my eyes. Karen leaned forward like a predator who smelled weakness. "You expect us to believe that? This equipment clearly exceeds what a normal homeowner would need. You have industrial-grade tools and multiple power systems. You're either lying or failing to disclose your business operations." She turned to the others, nodding, as if her accusation had just been confirmed by divine authority. The man sitting next to her, a kind-looking retiree with wire glasses, cleared his throat. "Karen, I think we should let him explain before we jump to conclusions." His attempt at reason earned him a glare that could have curdled milk. I opened the folder I'd brought with me and slid out my contractor's license, insurance paperwork, and photos of the shed from when I bought the house, complete with the original inspection report. "Everything I own is up to code," I said. "I work for the county as a demolition engineer. I design safe teardowns for old properties. Those tools are standard for my trade." That last line seemed to catch her attention. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her expression, quickly masked by indignation. "Demolition engineer?" she repeated, like the words themselves were suspicious. "So you destroy things for a living?" "I remove unsafe structures," I corrected, already sensing where she was headed. She folded her hands on the table, tilting her head. "Interesting. And yet your own shed is in violation of our maintenance standards. The paint is chipped, the roofline uneven, and it obstructs visual harmony with adjacent properties." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It slipped out before I could stop myself. The idea of visual harmony being disrupted by a structure barely visible from the street was absurd. "Ma'am," I said, "the only person who can see my shed is you, and that's because you keep trespassing into my backyard." The room fell silent. One of the board members coughed. Karen's eyes narrowed into slits. "I was performing my duties as president," she snapped. "We have every right to inspect properties when violations are suspected." "Actually, you don't," I said, "not without the owner's consent or a warrant. And definitely not while live streaming from someone else's property." Her face flushed a deep red, the kind that comes from being challenged in public. "This level of disrespect will not be tolerated." The board will issue a formal fine and a written warning for insubordination. Insubordination? I repeated, incredulous. You do realize I don't work for you, right? That earned me a collective intake of breath from the audience. About a dozen neighbors had shown up to watch, most of them curious rather than supportive. A few exchanged amused looks, clearly enjoying seeing someone talk back to the HOA president. Karen, however, was seething. She launched into a long monologue about community standards, property values, and the dangers of non-compliance. It was all theater. She needed to assert control because control was her oxygen. The more she talked, the more I realized this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about dominance. I could have installed the Mona Lisa on my shed door, and she'd have found a reason to fine me for improper framing. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to review my case and deliver a decision within 10 days. I thanked them politely and left, feeling both exhausted and strangely entertained. The entire performance had been so transparently ridiculous that it almost didn't seem real. But as I walked home, a new thought started forming in the back of my mind, one that made me smile despite the frustration. Karen wanted to play games with building codes. That was fine, because unlike her, I actually knew them. And if she wanted a war over structures, she was about to lose it in spectacular fashion. After that ridiculous hearing, I decided it was time to dig deeper into who Karen really was and what she thought gave her the right to act like the sheriff of the neighborhood. Her obsession with rules didn't come from nowhere. People like her usually hide something. That night, while scrolling through the county's online property database, I typed in her address out of curiosity. What I found made my stomach drop, and then, slowly, start to twist into something that felt an awful lot like satisfaction. Her precious garage, the one she'd bragged about converting into her HOA command center, didn't exist in any legal record. There was no building permit, no inspection report, not even a line item under her property improvements. The structure was completely unapproved, which meant it was technically illegal. I zoomed in on the satellite view, double-checking the measurements against her plot lines, and realized something even more delicious. She had built that garage 6 feet over her property boundary. Part of it sat directly on county easement land. It was a bureaucratic nightmare waiting to happen, and she was standing in the middle of it. The discovery hit me in waves. First disbelief, then amusement, and finally a sense of poetic irony so sharp I had to laugh. For months, maybe years, she'd been patrolling everyone else's lawns, citing imaginary regulations, and threatening fines for the most minor cosmetic offenses. Meanwhile, the monument to her own hypocrisy sat right there, an illegal structure held together by denial and paint. I decided not to act immediately. There's an art to timing, especially when you're dealing with someone who thrives on confrontation. Instead, I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. I visited the county planning office under the pretense of reviewing public records for a work project. The clerk, a friendly woman named Dana, recognized Karen's name before I even finished explaining. She rolled her eyes and lowered her voice. She's filed 27 code complaints in the last 2 years, she said. Every single one dismissed. We know her well. When I asked about the garage, Dana raised an eyebrow. Oh, that thing, she said. We've suspected for years it wasn't permitted, but no one's filed a formal report. It's on public easement land too, which means technically it violates county infrastructure codes. If a complaint came through the system, we'd have to act on it. I left the office with a copy of the zoning map, the original permit history, and a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. That evening, I walked past Karen's house under the guise of taking out the trash. Through her open garage window, I saw what looked like a full-blown command post. File cabinets, clipboards, and a corkboard covered in printed photos of people's houses. My house had its own section, labeled Ongoing Issue. Watching her move around in there, sipping wine and muttering to herself while updating whatever imaginary database she kept, I realized how completely she'd lost touch with reality. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was ruling it like a kingdom she'd built on paperwork and paranoia. That garage wasn't just an illegal building, it was her throne room, and she'd constructed it in the one place that didn't belong to her. The next day, I went back to my shed and took care of some actual maintenance. It felt good to work on something real, something built with permission and sweat instead of ego. As I painted over the repaired roof panels, I thought about how people like Karen always collapse under their own weight eventually. The problem is, They tend to take everyone around them down too, unless someone stops them first. I knew what I had to do, but I wasn't going to act out of anger. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. So, I filed my report, calmly and officially, attaching every piece of documentation I'd collected. No accusations, no commentary, just facts. The woman at the county desk smiled knowingly as she stamped the papers. "You're doing the neighborhood a favor," she said. By the time I got home, Karen was already pacing in her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting toward my house every few seconds. Somehow she'd found out. Maybe the planning office had called her for verification. Maybe she just sensed that her empire was cracking. That evening, I heard her ranting on the phone to someone, her voice rising with each word. "They can't do this to me. I'm the president. I have authority. It's a mistake." I stood at my window watching her through the blinds, feeling a strange calm settle over me. For the first time since she'd broken into my shed, the balance had shifted. The rules she worshipped were about to turn against her, and all I had to do was wait. Her own arrogance had built the trap, and now it was finally closing. When the letter from the county finally arrived, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. A bright yellow notice stamped with bold black letters declaring, "Unsafe structure, demolition ordered." I stood there in my driveway, holding it, feeling the weight of poetic justice in my hands. It was official. The very garage Karen had used to store her mountains of violation notices, her binders of neighborhood surveillance, and her endless supply of smug superiority had been declared unfit for existence. I didn't have to raise my voice or break a sweat. The law she loved so much had done the talking for me. I walked across the street to deliver the notice myself. I figured it was only polite. She was out front pruning imaginary imperfections from her hedges, wearing her signature sun visor and an expression that could curdle milk. When she saw me approach, her eyes narrowed immediately. "You can't be here," she said, snipping her shears in my direction, as if that made her more dangerous. I handed her the envelope without a word. She looked at it, then at me, her smile faltering as she read the header. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "That," I said, "is a demolition order from the county planning department. Your garage violates the building and zoning codes. They've scheduled an inspection to confirm, but it looks like the structure will need to come down." I wanted to sound neutral, but the satisfaction in my voice slipped through anyway. For a long moment, she just stared at the paper. I could see the calculations flickering behind her eyes, the disbelief, the denial, the desperate search for a loophole. Then came the explosion. She accused me of forgery, conspiracy, bribery, harassment, and whatever else she could think of in the heat of the moment. Her voice cracked as she shouted, and neighbors began poking their heads out from behind curtains, drawn by the sound of their self-appointed leader unraveling. I didn't say a word. I just let her rant until she ran out of breath, and then I wished her a pleasant afternoon before walking back to my side of the street. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in the most entertaining way possible. Karen called emergency board meetings, threatened legal action against the county, and even tried to rally the neighborhood to protest the unjust persecution of community leadership. But it turned out that the residents she'd spent years bullying weren't exactly eager to take up her cause. One by one, her former allies began quietly backing away, pretending not to hear when she came knocking with her petitions. The woman who once barked orders at everyone was now shouting into an empty echo chamber. The county inspection took place the following Tuesday. A white truck with the official seal parked right in front of her house, and 3 inspectors in hard hats stepped out with clipboards. They walked the property line, measured the garage dimensions, took photos, and spoke to Karen for maybe 2 minutes before she slammed her front door in their faces. From where I stood trimming my hedges, I could see them shake their heads, jot something down, and drive away. Later that afternoon, a second notice went up on her garage door, confirming demolition authorization. It was happening. That night, Karen's porch light stayed on until well past midnight. Through the window, I could see her pacing, phone pressed to her ear, probably calling anyone who would listen. Maybe she was trying to reach a lawyer, maybe the mayor, maybe the universe itself. But deep down, I think she already knew there was nothing left to save. The very laws she'd weaponized against everyone else had turned on her, and there was no one left willing to fight on her behalf. 2 days later, a demolition crew arrived to take initial measurements. Karen stood on her lawn, shouting at them to leave, claiming diplomatic immunity from the HOA as if that meant anything to county contractors. They ignored her, marking the perimeter with spray paint and taking pictures of the crumbling foundation. I stood in my yard, sipping coffee, pretending to water the flowers, while silently enjoying every second of it. When she finally realized I was watching, she shouted across the street, "You think you've won, don't you?" I didn't answer. There was nothing to win. This was never about revenge, not really. It was about balance, about watching the universe quietly reset itself after years of abuse and arrogance. By the time the crew packed up and drove off, the orange boundary lines glowed under the afternoon sun like a countdown timer. Her garage's fate was sealed. She stood there clutching that same clipboard, but it suddenly looked small in her hands, like a relic from another lifetime. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, she didn't have anything left to say. When I went inside, I glanced back through the window. Karen was still standing in her driveway, staring at the notice taped to her garage door. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she knew it. I didn't feel pity or anger anymore, just peace. The kind of peace that only comes when karma finally clocks in for work and does the job better than you ever could. The morning of the demolition arrived calm and bright, the kind of day when birds seem to sing louder and the air feels lighter. I woke earlier than usual, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood at my kitchen window watching the sunlight stretch across the roofs. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of dread every time I looked outside. The county truck pulled in around 9, followed by a flatbed carrying an excavator that gleamed in the morning light. Neighbors began drifting out of their houses, drawn by the noise, curiosity, and maybe a quiet sense of vindication. Karen appeared a few minutes later, wearing her usual sun visor, though her posture was different now. Her shoulders were tight, her chin trembling, but her voice still carried that brittle authority that had become her trademark. She marched across the lawn toward the workers, waving a stack of papers that probably weren't worth the ink they were printed with. I stepped onto my porch, sipping from my mug, and watched the scene unfold. She shouted that she was filing an injunction, that this was unlawful, that the county had made a grave mistake. The foreman, a man who looked like he had seen every flavor of suburban chaos, listened patiently, nodded once, and then gestured toward the official notice taped to her garage door. "Ma'am," he said, "we're just following the order. You might want to step back." When the first wall cracked under the excavator's claw, the sound echoed through the street like a thunderclap. A few people gasped. Someone even clapped quietly. Karen stood frozen, one hand over her mouth, her papers fluttering to the ground. Her fortress of self-importance, the shrine she'd built to control everyone around her, was reduced to splinters and dust. I expected to feel triumphant, maybe even smug, but what I felt was something closer to relief. It was like watching a storm finally pass after months of constant lightning. As the debris piled higher, the other neighbors began to talk. For so long, everyone had tiptoed around her, afraid of being fined or gossiped about. But now, freed from her reign of nitpicking terror, people were laughing again. The man next door offered coffee to the demolition crew. A few kids rode their bikes up and down the street, circling the pile like explorers charting new territory. The tension that had defined our block for years seemed to dissolve with every crash of concrete. Karen eventually retreated inside her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass. When the crew finished clearing the wreckage, all that remained of her garage was a rectangle of flattened dirt and a lonely mailbox that had once been nailed to its wall. The foreman walked over to me as he packed up his clipboard. "You the guy who filed the report?" he asked. I nodded, though I felt no need to explain. He gave a half smile and said, "Good call. That thing was a hazard waiting to happen." The neighborhood settled into a strange kind of quiet after that. The next few days were almost peaceful, though I noticed Karen less and less. Her car stayed in the driveway, but the blinds were always drawn. The HOA board quietly dissolved itself within a week, citing organizational restructuring, though everyone knew it was because no one wanted to take her place. For the first time since moving in, I could stand in my backyard without feeling watched. One evening, as the sun went down, I walked over to where her garage used to be. The ground was still uneven, marked by tire tracks and patches of exposed clay. A few pieces of concrete stuck out from the dirt like old bones. Standing there, I thought about how fragile power can be when it's built on control instead of respect. Karen had spent years trying to build authority out of fear, and, to the end, It collapsed faster than the walls of her garage. That night, the air was quiet, broken only by the steady chirp of crickets. I sat on my porch with another cup of coffee and realized how long it had been since I'd heard the sound of my own peace. No arguments, no threats, no unsolicited inspections, just stillness. A few days later, I saw her again. She was standing on her porch, staring across the street at the empty space where her garage had once been. She looked smaller somehow, not just in stature, but in presence. For a brief second, our eyes met. I nodded politely. She didn't nod back, but she didn't scowl either. She just turned away and went back inside. That was the last time I ever saw her. The neighborhood is different now. People wave more. The lawns don't have to be perfect, and nobody cares if your trash cans sit out an extra day. It's quiet, calm, and strangely alive. Sometimes, when I pass the spot where her garage once stood, I can't help but smile. It reminds me that karma doesn't always come roaring in like a hurricane. Sometimes, it shows up quietly with a clipboard, a backhoe, and a county seal, and it lets the dust settle all on its own. And that's how my nosy HOA Karen broke into my shed and lost her garage instead. There's a special kind of peace that comes from watching karma arrive on schedule, complete with an excavator and a county permit. These days, the neighborhood's calmer. People plant gardens, fix fences, and nobody cares if your shed is 1 inch taller than regulation. Funny how freedom sounds a lot like silence. If you've ever had a neighbor who mistook authority for oxygen, hit that subscribe button for more stories of poetic suburban justice. Drop a comment with your own HOA horror story. Trust me, venting's cheaper than therapy. Until next time, may your lawns be peaceful, your sheds secure, and your Karens evicted.